For almost 2 decades now, I've worked as a helicopter pilot for Utah's Department of Public Safety. People are often surprised by what a varied job it actually is. Because while we obviously provide a lot of support to law enforcement, we also perform medical evacuations, assist with wildfire and disaster response, and most relevant to my story today, we support search and rescue operations out in the Rockies. I'm on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so sometimes I'm grabbing my gear in the middle of dinner or in the middle of the night because someone's gotten themselves into trouble in the UWC. That's the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest, about 30 miles east of Salt Lake. Most of the time the calls come from hikers or climbers who get lost or hurt in the mountains, or sometimes we get skiers caught in avalanches during winter. But then other times, I find myself flying into situations that are much more unsettling than just a lost hiker or stranded skier. And the bird I fly most is the Airbus H-125, a single-engine helicopter that's ideal for flying through the Rockies. It's got enough power for high-altitude work, which is crucial around here since elevations can regularly push 10,000 feet or more during search and rescue operations. I take off from the airport in Salt Lake, and then within minutes, I'm soaring up into the mountains to link up with the ground team. The air gets thin quick, so you gotta manage your power carefully. The H-125 handles it well, but it can sometimes feel very different to flying at sea level. It's beautiful up there in the mountains, but the weather can turn on a dime. One minute it's clear blue skies, the next you're dealing with turbulence from downdrafts off the peaks, or snowstorms that come out of nowhere and cut visibility down to nothing. But even when the weather's fine, the kind of flying they have to do up there can get real dangerous real quick. On more than one occasion, I've had to hover in tight spots, like above a narrow ridge with my rotors less than 20 feet or so from the treetops. I then have to hold that position on pain of death while the crew lowers the hoist to a stranded climber with a busted leg. Those hoists really come in handy for pulling people out of tough spots, like steep canyons or cliffs where you can't land, but they're not a fix-all. To fill the gaps, me and my crew keep the bird loaded up with stuff like night vision goggles, searchlights, and reco detectors, a real handy piece of equipment which can pinpoint people wearing reflective clothing. Because flying SAR missions in the Utah Rockies is no joke, we need all the help we can get out there. And despite all I've said, most ops are actually pretty straightforward in terms of what we do. We spot them, drop a line, and then haul them out and crack a beer back at HQ. But there's one from a couple of years back that still has me wondering what in the world really happened out there. It started just like any other call might do, with a phone on my nightstand dragging me out of sleep. The missing man's wife had called 911 just a few hours before after her husband failed to return home following a solo hike up near Hayden Peak. I wasn't expecting anything too intense. The last couple of ops involved rescuing pencil-pushing city boys who'd bitten off more than they could chew, so I figured it might be more of the same. But after flying over the area surrounding Farm Creek Peak, we couldn't spot our hiker anywhere. The ground team was already on location, with some combing the trails on ATVs, so we decided to open up our search area to see what we could find. Eventually, we found ourselves flying over a place called Wilson's Peak, the highest point in the entire state of Utah. And the terrain up there is brutal, with sheer cliffs and deep snowpack, and since it was a long way off the area our hiker was said to be, we didn't expect to find anything. But no sooner had we gotten close enough that my pilot spotted something through thermal imaging. It was weak, but it was damn sure human-shaped, and it was up on a narrow bluff about 8,000 feet up. I banked us closer, eyes peeled, and then suddenly, there he was, the missing hiker. He was sitting near a ledge, no tent, no pack, just him in a thin jacket, limply waving one arm and looking like he'd been through hell. I radioed the ground teams, telling them that we had a visual and passing on the man's coordinates, and the ground team acknowledged and then sent ATVs in our direction. But after a tense 20 minutes of them probing the approaches, the leads come back over the radio saying the approach is iced over and far too steep. To get to the guy without putting the chopper in danger, they'd need specialists with climbing gear, which would take around 2 hours. And the trouble was, from the looks of him, I didn't think the guy had 2 hours left. Now I looked at my co-pilot, and he looked at me, and we both agreed, screw it. We're going in low, drop the line. And to say it was a risky move would be one heck of an understatement. Regulations say to keep a buffer for wind shear and rotor wash, but I dipped the nose and threaded the chopper between pine trees and the contour of the slope. The altimeter started yelling warnings at me as we got within 50 feet of the bluff, which was dangerously low for a winch op in such gusty conditions. My winch medic, a guy with balls of steel named Tony Reyes, clipped the winch to his rig, lowered himself onto the cable as I hovered in place, then edged across the ledge towards our missing hiker. Once he reached him, Reyes asked the guy if it was good enough to hold on to something. The guy couldn't stand, but Reyes managed to get the very unglamorously named crotch strap between his legs, and then with a little assistance, he was good to go. We couldn't linger. Fuel was burning and the winds were picking up. I spotted a flat meadow a mile down the valley, clear and flat enough to safely set down Reyes and the hiker. My co-pilot pulled the line up a little and up came Reyes and our hiker, and then off we went to gently drop them off before I set us down and we waited for the ground crew. Once our rotors were still, myself and my co-pilot hopped out to go check on the hiker. We found him propped up against a log, wrapped in foil blankets, while Reyes set up an IV, but something was off. Our hiker had been missing for less than 24 hours, but he looked gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days, and he was dehydrated to the point that his tongue was a little swollen and he had trouble speaking. Even stranger, the guy couldn't seem to remember his own name. Not at first, anyway. Hypothermia makes people slow, but it doesn't fog their memory, and this guy was all glassy-eyed and confused when we asked his name. He didn't say it, but we could tell that he couldn't remember. And then after maybe a minute or two, it seemed to just come back to him, like the phone number of an old girlfriend or something. And I remember kneeling down next to him and saying, "Hey buddy, what happened? How'd you end up in that?" And he broke eye contact and then stared off, kind of blinking for a second, before saying he couldn't remember. And the only things he did remember were hiking alone, realizing someone was following him, and then running to try and escape them. Then the next thing he knew, he was way up the side of the mountain, too exhausted to climb back down again. And that was it. No significant details to go on. No coherent timeline. Just he was alone, got scared, and then ran in a blind panic till he came to again. The ground team rolled up on their ATVs within maybe 10 to 15, and then the medics began swarming the guy. We waited for Reyes to finish talking to the ground team lead, hoping that the guy would get more talkative as he warmed up. But he didn't. His memory stayed foggy, and we never found out how a guy with no equipment climbed all the way up to that bluff. The paramedics chalked it up to exposure or delirium, and missing hikers often try to climb up high so aircraft can spot them and don't anticipate the nights getting fatally cold. So after they loaded him up, they took him off to the ER in Provo for treatment, saying all would make sense once the guy's memory came back to him. We wrapped the op, flew back to base, and then debriefed with all the standard paperwork. Now, we'd done our job, maybe even saved a guy's life in the process, so it should have been high fives all around after hitting the bar for celebration beers. But all we did was sit around talking about it because none of it made any sense. The bluff near Wilson's Peak was almost a day's walk from Hayden, the place the guy was reported missing. That meant that he'd hiked and climbed over 15 miles as the crow flies to get from Hayden to Wilson, which, if you know the terrain, seems next to impossible, especially at night. And then to get up the bluff that he was on, he must have truly believed that his life was in danger because I don't know if you're a climber or if any climbers are actually listening, but I'm talking class 5 scrambling against vertical faces, something any usual amateur would consider themselves incapable of. Now this guy had no climbing gear, no experience listed in his profile, as the family confirmed that he was a casual weekend walker from the flatlands. And so in that case, how the heck did he free climb that in a panic, in snow, without breaking his own damn neck? Investigators followed up on his claims of a pursuit, but they didn't find a second set of tracks on the snows below, and there were no reports of suspicious activity from any place else in the park. The guy recovered physically and was happily reunited with his wife and kids following a brief stay in the hospital, but his memories stayed like Swiss cheese. The last thing he recalled clearly was realizing that he was being followed, and then apart from a few flashes of running, climbing, and fearing for his life, it was all dark patches. In the years since, I must have gone it over in my head maybe 100 times already, And I wonder what spooked the guy so bad that he actually turned into a damn mountain goat. And the only thing that really tracks is a bear. A big old black bear standing on 2 legs, which might have started chasing him on 4, and that's the only sight that I could figure would trigger that kind of primal fear, in which case it could have been a mama bear just taking care of her cubs. But then what if it wasn't? What if it really was a man out there lurking among the trees and waiting for some hapless hiker to come along so he could hunt them through the trees? I mean, let me know what you think, but both are scary in their own way. But it still doesn't explain the distances involved or how our hiker climbed up that bluff. And it kills me thinking I'll never find out, and it will forever remain a mystery. She was the golden girl of Hollywood, beautiful, untouchable, and marked by tragedy. From childhood, whispers followed her, a curse said to trail her wherever she went. One night beneath a black and endless sea, that curse finally called her name, and the waves answered. Hear more of this story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. When I was 28 years old, I was still living in Denver, and a few friends and I went out for dinner and drinks. It was fun at first, but as the sun went down and the alcohol started to flow, I realized that I just wasn't feeling it. I'd really gotten into yoga, running, and eating healthy that summer, so even though staying out late and partying was still fun, I just didn't have the energy for it anymore. I stayed for one last drink before saying goodbye to my friends and then walked outside to catch a cab. And then as I was waiting, I heard a man's voice off to the right of me asking, "Are you waiting for a cab too?" And that is how I met Patrick. It turns out we're in very similar situations. He'd been out celebrating his brother's birthday, but had quit drinking a few years back. And so before everyone got too drunk and too annoying, he figured that he'd head home to save himself the headache. Now, I like the idea of a guy who didn't drink, so after establishing that we were both single and of similar ages, I began to drop some not-so-subtle hints that he should ask for my number. We were having such fun flirting that we almost didn't notice when an empty cab drove right past us. And then when the next one came around, Patrick insisted that I be the one to take it. Now, he was a gentleman, and he was handsome, and he was charming, so when he texted me about grabbing some coffee sometime, you can bet that I texted back. We dated for 2 years and fell deeply in love with one another. He was the ideal partner, except for one tiny peccadillo: his past. Now, I know in literally any other circumstance a guy not being frank about his history is a huge red flag, but Patrick wasn't entirely opaque. He talked about high school, he talked about climbing the career ladder in his 20s, and he was willing to be frank about past relationships too. The other thing he wasn't so open about was college. He said his first 2 years were basically non-stop partying, and it got so bad that he had to repeat a few courses during his sophomore year. He talked about falling in with a pretty bad crowd and how he had to cut himself off from them just to get his degree. And I could tell that he was embarrassed, maybe even a little ashamed, so I didn't push him on it. I just liked that he'd changed. And then one day, Patrick asked me to go hiking with him. Now, I was surprised because Patrick was just about the least outdoorsy type of guy you could imagine. He worked out, but he loved the indoor gym that he was a member of, and he was way more interested in gadgets and gizmos than the natural world. So when he asked me if I wanted to go hiking of all things, I was actually kind of stunned, but I was super excited. You see, maybe 6 months prior, we'd been talking about the prospect of getting married and even having children. Not so much with each other, it was just sort of a in general thing. Patrick asked what my ideal proposal location would be, and he gave me examples like the bridge in Central Park or the top of the Eiffel Tower. But after considering it, I decided I'd much rather be proposed to in a place of natural beauty rather than artificial. And I remember he nodded like, "Okay, unconventional, I like it." But I never thought in a million years he'd actually keep it in mind. So that Sunday morning when he asked if I wanted to go hiking up near Golden Gate Park that following weekend, it dawned on me how Patrick might actually be planning on proposing. And I started freaking out in text messages to friends saying that I didn't know if I was ready. Now, I mean, I wanted to marry him. I just didn't know what kind of wife I was going to be or if our relationship would survive the transition from casual to serious commitment. A friend said that I was just overthinking things and that I should just trust that initial gut feeling of excitement. It was true that realizing a proposal was on the cards had made me so very happy. So rather than continue to ruminate, I just simply waited for the date of the hiking trip. And when it came, I just knew that I was going to say yes. Now, the first 2 hours or so was just a dream. My usually outdoorsy, averse boyfriend had put a ton of effort into making sure that he had all the right equipment, and being his typical self, he brought a bunch of cool gadgets along too. Stuff like straws with built-in water filters and solar-powered phone chargers just in case we got low on battery. And the scenery was beautiful. The weather in the Rockies was great, and as Patrick guided us along the trails towards our mystery destination, I got more and more excited. And before long, he took us up the trail that wound up this very steep slope, and when we got to the top, we found ourselves at a sort of steep earthen cliff that overlooked the forest below. It was an incredible view, and knowing what was coming, I started to get a little emotional. Now Patrick looked at me, smiling as I wiped away the tears and said, "You know what I'm going to ask you, right?" And I just laughed and said yes, expecting him to drop to one knee and produce a ring at any moment. But he didn't. Instead, Patrick started explaining how he had brought me all the way out there to propose. There was just something he needed to tell me first. Now right away I got nervous and Patrick could sense it. I thought that he'd try and reassure me that it wasn't anything too serious, but he didn't. He just stayed quiet until I'm saying something like, "Well, what is it?" He asked me if I loved him and if I trusted him. But when I answered yes, he didn't seem any more sure of himself. He asked if I could keep a secret, if I could keep the most important secret of his whole life, and again, I said yes. But I was wrong. Patrick began telling me how, during his second year of college, he and his frat buddies went to an off-campus party, some kind of warehouse rave type of deal. And he said this was when he and his friends were on their very worst behavior, drinking like fish and fighting like sailors, and generally causing trouble for anyone and everyone. And then at this party, he starts flirting with this girl and they head off someplace to make out. Patrick said that they made out for a while, and then the girl says something like, "Come back inside and dance with me." But after he returned from what passed for a bar, the girl was gone. Now he went looking all over for her but couldn't find her anywhere. And then when he spots her, maybe a half hour later, she's completely obliterated. Patrick said that he didn't know it was liquor. It was something else like roofies, but the girl seemed on the verge of passing out. He tried to get her back to the frat house, but when she was just about conscious enough to object, Patrick didn't want to go home empty-handed, shall we say. He did look and sound like he was ashamed of himself as he said it, but Patrick admitted to taking this semi-conscious girl to some dark corner of the warehouse compound and doing stuff to her. And I guess the look of disgust on my face was plain to see because he frantically added that this was the single biggest regret of his entire life, and he explained how he wasn't that guy anymore, how it made him afraid to have daughters knowing certain kinds of men harbor some predatory instincts. And he said it was a long time ago, that he'd lived with the regret ever since, and I thought that was it. And it was only after a minute or two of just sort of processing it that I asked if he'd ever tried to find the girl and make amends for what he'd done. And that's when I realized that this story wasn't over. Patrick said when he was done, he left the girl lying there where she was. She was passed out completely by then, but all he gave a crap about was going back inside to get a drink because he was thirsty. Now he too was highly intoxicated at this point, but he didn't use that as an excuse for his behavior. He knew how selfish it was for him to just leave her there. She could have been overdosing, or she could have choked on her own puke, but Patrick said it was a full hour before it occurred to him to go back and check on her. He said he asked his friends not to leave till he got back, and then he went out expecting to find the girl sleeping, as he put it. And yet when he got there, he found that not only was the girl awake and was somewhat more sober than before, but she remembered what he'd done to her before she passed out anyway, and she was obviously livid. She told Patrick that she was going to go to the cops because she wasn't about to let some piece of crap frat boy get away with treating her like that. I felt proud of her, and I didn't even know her, but Then Patrick said something that made my blood run cold when he described how he snapped. He said he pictured his whole life unraveling and how life after prison wouldn't be worth living. He had the world at his feet, but that girl was about to yank the carpet out from under him, and he couldn't let that happen. When Patrick finally uttered the words to me, "I didn't mean to kill her," I felt my entire world crumbling around me. And it was like this out-of-body experience, watching myself from afar while my heart broke in my chest. Not just for me either, and the life I thought I was going to have. I was heartbroken for that poor girl, and just trying to do the right thing resulted in Patrick accidentally crushing her larynx. He said he just wanted to scare her at first, and then he just wanted to make the problem go away. But all that fear had him squeezing just a little too hard, and Patrick didn't realize just how much damage he was doing until he felt the girl's throat just sort of give way in his hands. He said her eyes went all wide as she tried to get air into her lungs, but she couldn't. And then maybe a minute or two later, she was dead. Patrick said he could have ran for help, but he didn't because he was scared. And instead of getting help, and once he was sure that the girl was dead, Patrick went back inside the warehouse party and asked his closest friend in the frat for one hell of a favor. It was one he granted, and then over the next couple of hours they managed to hide the girl's body someplace no one would ever find it. Patrick never said exactly where, but he kinda hinted it was some kind of state park or forest, at which point it suddenly made sense why he hated the idea of hiking. He told me he was sorry, deeply and truly sorry, and that he'd do anything to take back his mistake. But it was also a mistake committed by his old self, his younger self, and he didn't think that it was one his new self had to pay for. Patrick then asked me if I thought that was a reasonable thing to say, and I suddenly realized just how vulnerable I really was. If I said no, and that I thought that he was a murdering piece of crap, and I didn't want to marry him, what was to stop him from silencing me too? He could just shove me down the steep slope and then bash my head in at the bottom to finish me off, and no one might ever find me. I'd end up just like that girl, on a missing poster with my family wondering what the hell had happened to me, but deep down, knowing that I was gone. I knew I couldn't reject him. I knew I had to at least act like I understood. And so I underwent one of the most painfully surreal experiences of my entire life, and I pretended to be the fiancé of a murderer, someone who violates people. And I told him I agreed, that the new him shouldn't have to pay for his old crimes. I told him I wasn't about to let one shot at happiness slip through my fingers because some skank decided to run her mouth. I'm ashamed to say that I said that, but it's true. I'd have said just about anything to get out of that forest alive, because I figured what I planned on really doing would justify it. I leaned into the morbid curiosity that I felt and asked if he was scared that the girl's body would end up being found, and more importantly, what was going to happen to us if he ended up getting caught. Colorado had the death penalty at the time, so as Patrick said, if he got caught, it was over for us. And then we talked about the prospect of dating again after one of us passes away. Like I said, it was surreal in the extreme, but, and this is probably going to sound insane, I felt safe with him. I thought I had him. I thought I tricked him. And then after our hike was done and we walked back to his car, I felt this rush of almost victory knowing that I'd survived. And all I had to do to ensure my continual survival was to sort of keep the act up till I could get home and call the cops. But before I could do that, all the pretending I'd done resulted in a state of almost complete nervous collapse. After getting home, I think I cried for a straight hour, and then I called my mom and cried for another hour on top of that. It was probably the worst day of my life, hands down, in terms of catastrophic mental trauma, but then once I was done crying, I'd pulled myself together and hung up on Mom and then called 911. I packed an overnight bag as I waited for them to arrive because I planned on staying with my mom for the foreseeable future after Patrick got arrested. Now, I was scared that they'd maybe let him go for some reason, be it lack of evidence or him getting bail or whatever, but it turned out that I didn't have to worry about anything like that because when the cops showed up at his place looking to talk with him, he was nowhere to be found. I talked to the Denver PD a lot in the weeks that followed, but I also ended up getting a call from 2 detectives in Arizona where Patrick went to college. They were very interested in his story because the location of the murder, along with the timing of the girl's disposal, made it easier to figure out where to look. I then also got a call from an FBI agent who asked if Patrick ever went by another name or if he ever mentioned owning a fake passport. I said no to both questions, and the agent never came out and said it, but it was kind of obvious that they thought Patrick had fled the country somehow. They just didn't know how or where he'd gone. And then the agent asked if there was anywhere in the world that I thought he might have gone, somewhere special that he might have mentioned wanting to visit. And I told them about Patrick mentioning Paris and Rome one time, but aside from that, he'd never seemed all that interested in traveling. And to this day, he's never been found. But I still hold out hope that he'll show up someplace one day and that he'll finally have to pay for what he did to that poor girl. And that's almost my ideal scenario. I open the newspaper one day and there's Patrick's face under the headline saying something like "fugitive apprehended overseas." But my nightmare scenario goes a little something like this. One day, and maybe even someday soon, I'm sitting home alone and there's a knock at my door. I go to open it, so comfortable and confident that I don't bother checking the peephole. And then when I open it, there he is. There's Patrick. And he's come to shut me up. For good. You probably never think it to look at me today, but I used to be a pretty cool guy back when. These days, I make a living fixing cars and motorcycles, partly on the back of skills that I picked up in my former life as the guitarist in a touring rock and roll band. Now, we never made it big or anything. We didn't sell out stadiums or earn a platinum record, but we made enough money selling tapes and t-shirts and merchandise and tickets to our shows to earn a pretty decent living for ourselves. Now, we were based out of Boston and played a lot of shows in New York and Philly, but we also played all over the country too, doing that old school touring schedule thing of planning conquests with nothing but a map and a phone book. And that's how we ended up doing a kind of Rocky Mountain rock and roll tour during the summer of 1977, one that took us through Utah, Wyoming, and most relevant to this story, Colorado. And so we managed to book ourselves onto the bill of a music festival in a little mountain town called Lake City. It was a bit of a family affair, so we played a couple of Gordon Lightfoot and Neil Diamond numbers, along with a couple of the softer tunes. Now, it was light duty, as my World War II vet dad used to say, and we were still working, but it was also a chance to relax and recharge our batteries a little before the heavier shows up in Aspen and Boulder and Denver started. Now, we finished our set at around 5:30 and then walked around talking to the locals and enjoying their hospitality. I have myself a little green chili bison burger, a delicacy that no other burger has managed to top, by the way, while our bassist, this crazy SOB, ate a whole plate of Rocky Mountain oysters all to himself, much to the amusement of the locals, it would seem. And if you don't know what those are, boy, do I envy you. Now, one of the folks we got to talking to was a man named Jed, who was particularly pleased with us thanks to our cover of If You Could Read My Mind, which he said was his and his wife's song. Now, we got to talking about some of the other music we like to play, and at the mention of Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, he joked about us being a band of traveling Satanists. He knew all the panic surrounding metal was bullcrap and remembered when the release of Psycho back in 1960 had folks saying society was quote-unquote going to hell. He even said he took his teenage son to see Carrie during Thanksgiving weekend of that previous year, and as a huge fan of the King, we quickly established a mutual love of all things creepy. Now, maybe an hour or two later, Jed said that he had to jet, but before he did, he asked if we'd be interested in seeing a genuine ghost town named Carson before we left for our next stop. Now, we were pretty thrilled at the idea because doing cool stuff like that was half the reason we went on tour in the first place. We didn't just get to play shows and make money, we got to see America too. And I'd say that there were few things all 5 band members could get excited about, like the idea of seeing a real-life ghost town. We met up with Jed bright and early the next morning, and then we followed his car up a bunch of gravelly mountain tracks till we eventually reached a dead end. Jed apologized and said that we'd have to walk about a mile up the mountain to get to Carson, but we didn't mind at all. It was actually kind of nice to be able to stretch our legs after spending so long on the bus. And then after a short walk through a whole bunch of trees, we entered a clearing that had around a dozen wooden buildings, all standing, derelict. Now, Jed told us Carson was founded back in 1889 as a silver mining settlement, and that for a few years it was home to almost 500 miners, as well as around half a dozen families who sold them food and equipment and laundry services. The town prospered for a few years, with a few extra bunkhouses being built to accommodate even more of those miners. But by 1895, not a single soul remained, and Carson had been completely abandoned. And when we asked what happened, Jed told us that there were two explanations, the official one and the unofficial one. The official one had been propagated by the town's owner and financier, who tried selling the land because the silver mine had supposedly run dry. But the unofficial explanation, which Jed says was the God's honest truth, had been passed by word of mouth from generation to generation, and this one was considerably creepier. Jed said that he'd heard the tale from his grandfather, who in turn had heard it from a lady who used to live up in Carson with her family. Jed's grandfather was a deputy sheriff, a man who could smell a lie the way other men could smell pie baking in an oven, and his grandpa believed every single word that lady had to say. He hadn't just heard it from her either. He said he met a handful of others who claimed to have been there that day. Some said a riot erupted up there in the mine and that the company's armed guards had to step in to put it down with lead. But the girl Jed's grandfather spoke to, her pa had actually gone up to the mine and seen the aftermath with his own two eyes. He said it was just some miners' strike that turned violent. It had been an all-out slaughter, with every man for himself. And the folks in Carson realized what was going on when a couple of wounded miners came running into town. They'd already heard gunshots echoing down the mountainside, but seeing as they relied on hunters and trappers for all their fresh meat, they didn't think much of it. But when those first miners came running into town, with cuts and stab wounds and riddled with buckshot, they sure as heck thought something of it then. Half the mining company's guards were off duty, either sleeping in the bunkhouse or drinking in the canteen. But when they heard how a bunch of miners had suddenly and unexpectedly started attacking their fellow workers and had even managed to overpower the on-duty guards, they grabbed their guns and ran up the mountain to assist them. And as more and more miners came limping down the mountain, the families living in Carson began tending to the wounded as best they could. They waited for the guards to come back, having put down the men responsible for starting the riot. But just like Jed said, it was no ordinary riot. And then when the gunfire stopped and no one came back down the mountain, some of Carson's menfolk ran up the slopes to see what had happened. But when they arrived, what they saw terrified them. There were dead bodies laying all around the mine's entrance, some belonging to miners and some belonging to guards. It made for a terrible scene, but it was nothing compared to what waited for them inside the mine. From the mine's entrance all the way down to its pit, the dead and dying lay side by side in puddles of each other's blood. Jed was told that in some sections, the blood ran down the shaft in little rivers as pools of it higher up began to overflow and run down the passageways. And there must have been at least 100 dead miners and another 50 on death's door. So as fast as they could, Carson's men began carrying the wounded out of the cave to be treated by the camp's doctor. And Jed said that he was told how awful the wounds were. Some men had been shot point blank with 12-gauge shotguns, meaning whole limbs had been blown off, and in other cases, whole torsos had been torn open and shredded. But the wounds inflicted by pickaxes were just as gruesome. Some men were completely impaled, handles hanging from their fronts with the point of pickaxes emerging from their backs. Others had their skulls completely annihilated, and in some cases, a dead man's only wound was a gaping hole in the top of his skull. It was a bloodbath, the worst thing any of Carson's men had ever seen, and they'd lived through half a dozen Rocky Mountain winters, 2 bear attacks, and even an attack by a gang of outlaws. They've seen some stuff in their time driving their wagons out east and living up in those mountains, but nothing like what they saw in that mine that day. Miners were dying just because they couldn't get help fast enough. The men would carry them out and they'd seem in pain but otherwise fine, Then when they got back to him after seeing to those who were more severely wounded, the men had bled to death. It was awful, but the killing wasn't over. Not yet. As the men are clearing out the wounded, they have to go deeper and deeper into the mine, and then at one point, the son of the town butcher went running down into the mine to go get some help, but he never came back. And when his father went down to look for him, he found his boy with a pickaxe in his hands, hacking up corpses so furiously that he was completely covered in their blood. His father tried to stop him, but the boy attacked him, and no matter how much his father tried, the boy wouldn't stop, and in the end, the butcher had to put his own son down to keep him from hurting anyone else. And then he came out of that mine screaming and insane with grief. And that's when they made the decision to seal the place up. And after gathering up as much dynamite as they could, the walking wounded were able to blow the entrance and bury both the dead and the wounded alike. There were rumors that seeing all that death made the boy go crazy, that his mind just couldn't handle it, and it slipped away from him as he walked among the dead with the coppery stink of fresh blood in the air. But those that were there say that there was something down there, maybe some kind of gas or fungal spore, that was to blame for making some of the miners turn on their comrades. It happened to the butcher's boy, and he himself got a dose when he was down there to look for his son, because all he could do was scream and cry and struggle as his friends and family tried to keep him still. He wasn't just out of his mind with the grief, there was something else affecting him, something the survivors thought best to bury. Jed said the mining company paid to have all the bodies collected and returned, but they fired the survivors and tried to have them in prison for blowing their mine sky high. The company thought they got everybody's body off that mountainside, but Jed said that he knew of people that had found bones in the woods below the mine. Not animal bones either, human bones. He actually asked if we wanted to go look for ourselves because there was a slim chance that we might even find a souvenir, as he put it. But we told him we were good and had seen all we needed to. If there was anywhere on Earth that was genuinely haunted, it was that old mining town, and we didn't want any of those old ghosts putting a curse on our tour because we'd been dumb enough to go off with some of those bones. And Jed laughed at that, and we did too, but it wasn't entirely a joke, not in my case anyway. We called it quits not long after, and then we're back on the road and headed for Aspen. We had Lake City and Carson in our rear view, but Jed's story stuck with me for the whole rest of the tour. It stuck with me so much that when we got back home, I rented a book from the Boston Library about mining disasters. Now, it made for, obviously, a terrifying read, and I learned that there's a gas called hydrogen sulfide, and it's something miners called stink damp, which is known to have a narcotic effect in certain doses. It is possible that the men at the mine's deepest point were suddenly exposed to high levels of this stink damp, at which point they lost their minds. And the rest of the massacre could possibly be explained by a kind of herd mentality or collective panic whereby confused and frightened men were gripped by a sort of primal kill or be killed mentality. But the thing I've never been able to figure out is why the guards turned on each other too. Jed said it appeared as if the company guards, the ones who'd been off-duty and stationed in town, had begun attacking each other during the final stages of the massacre. And to me, that suggests something other than narcotic gases were to blame for what had happened. I've often wondered what the real cause was, but there also comes a point where I tell myself to stop thinking about it because the things my imagination starts to dream up can really start to frighten me. One morning, way back in October of 2007, a retired day hiker was trekking up the North Lateral Moraine Trail when he came across a shallow karst cave system just off the beaten path. He claimed to have interest in what he called pioneer relics, things like rusted tin cans and shattered crockery left behind from the old covered wagons which used to snake through the front range. And so he made a habit of shining his flashlight into the darkness and looking around for old artifacts. But what he found that day was no antique. He found bones, human bones, and said that they were scattered around the cave floor and looked old, bleached, and white. And he thought that they were just animal bones at first, but then he found the skull. He told the dispatcher that he realized that it was a skeleton, maybe one left over from the Donner Party or at least some other tradition of the sea type situation. And he said they looked 100 years old, but he was wrong. And the person that proved him wrong was me. Whenever anyone finds human remains and they're not fresh, medical examiners like me get a call. And it's our job to head out to wherever the remains are found and give our expert opinion on how and why their owner passed away. Most of the time, we just simply drive over to the location of the remains and then drive back to the office once we're done. But on this occasion, since the remains were found way up in the Rockies, we were flying in by helicopter. We arrived around midday. Myself, a tech from the CBI lab in Greenlee, a photographer from the coroner's office, and a couple of rangers from the Park Service to keep the area secure. It took a while, but we eventually found the cave the hiker had referred to, which was more like a crack in the granite. And then we suited up in these Tyvek, those sort of white suits that you see in CSI, and then we flicked on our headlamps and entered the cave to lay out a 10 by 10 meter baseline. Now what struck me initially was that the remains were partial, meaning that it wasn't a complete skeleton. We found things like a detached mandible, fragments of a radius ulnar pair, and a scattering of phalanges and thoracic vertebrae. But there was no pelvis, and neither were there any long bones below the femora, as the thigh bones, which were also entirely absent. Now the hiker was right about the bones to an extent, because they appear to have been there for a very long time. Under the light of my LED beams, I could see the cortical bone was marred by fine vertical striations, which suggested decades of exposure to freezing winds. But then, the more I looked at it, the more something started to nag at me. When we found the skull, I took a good long look at it, and I was looking for gnaw marks from rodents or other tooth marks, which we call carnivore pitting, from large predators. But there was nothing but uniform periosteal stripping, which was way too clean to be weather damage. And this left only one plausible explanation. The flesh had been cut away from the bone by something very sharp. Now I bagged a sample right there, a shard of bone used for our preliminary histology, which is the fancy term for putting something under a microscope. And once we made a mobile unit set up at the trailhead, we ran the sample under the portable FTIR spectrometer and then watched it as it lit up like a flare. There was a high amount of hydroxyapatite crystallinity, but the sample also exhibited some unusual thermal degradation signatures, which to me indicated sublethal heating at a temperature of around 170 to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no charring, and what we were looking at wasn't any kind of regular diagenesis or decomposition, and that left only one feasible explanation. The bones had been boiled. After returning to the cave and continuing our analysis, more pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. We found a well-used enameled iron cooking pot at the rear of the cave. Traces of bone marrow residue clung to its interior, with its lipid profiles consistent with the same kind that comes from human femurs. High in oleic acid, low in polyunsaturated fats. The discovery of more bones proved that the defleshing had been anything but crude scavenging. It had been methodical. There were parallel incision marks on the ends of the bones, and judging by the microstriations, they'd been inflicted by some kind of carbon steel filleting knife, most likely complete with a serrated edge. And to the best of my judgment, I'd have to say the flesh had been removed immediately after death, before the bones were simmered to make a broth of tenderized marrow. There would be no logical reason to do this other than consumption, in which case, it made sense that the lower limbs were missing, as the medius cuts had most likely been hauled away for later. Now, in plain English, this wasn't the kind of survival cannibalism people were forced into on the Oregon Trail. It had been staged in isolation, most likely to evade prying eyes of rangers and hikers. This wasn't desperation. This was a feast. We had the remains airlifted to the Denver lab that afternoon, where a full post-mortem unfolded over the course of several weeks. Now, it took a while, but we heard the carbon dating on the sample we took pegged the year of death between 2003 and 2005. There was no corresponding dental records for the teeth that remained in the skull. The molars showed moderate damage, but there were no fillings or orthodontic work done, so my best guess involved being some kind of vagrant. Now, we extracted some degraded DNA and then ran it through the state's database, as well as CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, and we got 0 hits. There were no familial matches, no cold case crossovers, nothing. And in terms of where the victim was from, enamel analysis hinted at a Midwestern upbringing. But in contrast to my theory that this person was a vagrant, the only thing that came up in the toxicology reports were trace caffeine metabolites. There was no indication of a struggle, no restraint artifacts on the wrists. Cause of death was most likely asphyxiation or blunt force, executed elsewhere, then transported to the karst cave for what I guess you might call the harvest. The case files have been archived for more than 6 years now, gathering digital dust in the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's unsolved ledger. Now, the killer, who was most likely male considering the brute force required to do what he did, clean slipped the noose, so to speak, meaning somewhere out there in the sprawl of flyover country, or maybe in some tiny mountain town, there's a murderer and a cannibal breathing free air. I used to imagine it sometimes, his pot bubbling over with bone broth as he packaged up the better cuts. I can't forget it, and I know I never will, because in this line of work, some fractures never heal. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where we can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, all links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, say goodbye-bye to dog poop.